Breaking: Israel resumes airstrikes in Gaza. Ending ceasefire. Full investigative report. Rethink report. Comprehensive breakdown: a ceasefire between Israel and Palestinian factions in Gaza has collapsed, leading to a massive wave of Israeli airstrikes that have killed at least 235 people, including dozens of women and children. According to Gaza's health ministry, the bombings have destroyed homes, refugee shelters, hospitals, and vital infrastructure, with rescue workers struggling to reach survivors trapped under the rubble. Israel claims the strikes are a response to renewed rocket fire from Gaza into southern Israel. However, critics argue that Israel has escalated hostilities beyond military targets, worsening an already dire humanitarian crisis. This report will break down the exact timeline of how the ceasefire collapsed, casualty details, and on-the-ground reports legal and geopolitical impact of these airstrikes. What this means for Palestinians, Israel, and international diplomacy. Chapter 1. The ceasefire and how it collapsed. For nearly a month, Egypt, Qatar, and the United States had brokered a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. The agreement was fragile, but it offered a temporary halt to bombings, eased humanitarian restrictions, and limited military operations. However, tensions never fully subsided. Palestinian groups accused Israel of failing to uphold its commitments, particularly in allowing more humanitarian aid to reach Gaza, while Israel claimed Hamas was still planning attacks. The final collapse came when 2 rockets were fired from Gaza toward Israeli territory. One landed in an open area, causing no casualties, while the other was intercepted by Israel's Iron Dome defense system. No Israeli casualties were reported. Despite this, Israel responded with overwhelming force, launching dozens of airstrikes within hours, targeting densely populated civilian areas. Chapter 2. The airstrikes. What happened? At 4:30 a.m. local time, Israeli warplanes carried out a series of heavy bombings across the Gaza Strip. According to the Gaza Health Ministry, the airstrikes hit residential buildings, schools, medical centers, and a UN refugee shelter. Eyewitnesses described the destruction. Dr. Ahmed Salim, a physician at El Shifa Hospital, stated, "We are overwhelmed. The hospital is running out of supplies, and we cannot keep up with the number of casualties. Many of the victims are children. Some families have been completely wiped out." One of the deadliest strikes hit a densely populated neighborhood in Khan Yunis, where at least 40 civilians were killed when their apartment building collapsed. Rescue teams are still searching for survivors, but efforts are hampered by fuel shortages and infrastructure damage caused by previous attacks. Chapter 3. Civilian casualties and humanitarian crisis. As of now, at least 235 Palestinians have been killed, including 63 children and 41 women. More than 500 others are injured, many of them critically. With Gaza's only power plant running at minimal capacity, hospitals are struggling to keep life-saving medical equipment operational. Electricity is limited to 2 hours per day. Food and water shortages are worsening. Israel has restricted border crossings, preventing medical evacuation. Chapter 4. International reactions. The airstrikes have sparked global condemnation, with world leaders reacting strongly to the escalation. United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres stated, "The situation in Gaza is deteriorating at an alarming rate. Attacks on civilians must stop immediately. The world cannot stand by as innocent lives are lost." The United States issued a statement supporting Israel's right to self-defense but urging restraint. "We call on all sides to de-escalate. Civilians must be protected in accordance with international law." European Union leaders have demanded an emergency UN Security Council meeting, with France and Spain condemning the scale of Israel's response. Arab League nations, including Jordan and Egypt, have called the airstrikes a war crime and are pushing for UN sanctions. Chapter 5. Is Israel violating international law? Legal experts argue that Israel's latest airstrikes could constitute war crimes under international law. The Geneva Conventions prohibit attacks that disproportionately affect civilians. The Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court (ICC) defines war crimes as targeting civilian populations, destroying infrastructure critical for survival, using excessive military force in retaliation. The ICC has previously investigated Israeli actions in Gaza, and this new escalation may lead to renewed calls for prosecution. Chapter 6. The bigger picture. What happens next? The collapse of the ceasefire marks a dangerous turning point. With Gaza under siege, civilian casualties rising, and international pressure mounting, the conflict risks spiraling into an even more catastrophic war. If Israel continues its bombardment, expectations of further diplomatic fallout and possible sanctions could increase. Meanwhile, Palestinian factions are likely to retaliate, deepening the violence and suffering for civilians. Conclusion. The human cost of war. As Israel intensifies its bombing campaign, the world faces a critical question: how many more Palestinian civilians must die before serious intervention takes place? The cycle of ceasefires and bombings has been repeated countless times, yet no long-term solution has been reached. The situation in Gaza is not just a military conflict, it is a humanitarian crisis of unprecedented scale. Stay with Rethink Report as we continue to investigate and bring you unfiltered, fact-based journalism.